The wind howled through the desolate canyon, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie silver glow over the barren landscape. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped, its cry echoing off the jagged rocks. But there was something wrong with the sound, something unnatural. It was too high-pitched, too human. Emma tightened her grip on the flashlight, her knuckles white. She shouldn't have come out here. Not at night. Not after what the locals had warned her about. But curiosity had always been her downfall. That and her stubbornness. The stories had started weeks ago. Hikers gone missing. Livestock torn apart. Strange figures seen lurking at the edge of the woods, their movements too fluid, too wrong. The Navajo elders had whispered the word with a mixture of fear and reverence. Skinwalker, a shapeshifter. A creature that could wear the skin of man or beast, a predator that thrived on fear. Emma had laughed it off at first. Superstition, she called it. But now, standing alone in the middle of nowhere, the laughter felt like a distant memory. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. She swung the flashlight beam across the rocky terrain, the light trembling in her hand. The path back to her car was only a mile away, but it felt like an eternity. Every shadow seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. Every rustle of leaves made her heart skip a beat. And then she heard it. A low, guttural growl just behind her. Emma froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't move. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of something heavy dragging across the ground. Slowly she turned, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. At first she saw nothing. Just the empty expanse of the canyon, bathed in moonlight. But then, at the edge of the light, something moved. A shadow detached itself from the rocks, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. It was too tall to be a man, too thin to be an animal. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, reflecting the beam of her flashlight. Emma's stomach dropped. She took a step back, her boots crunching on the gravel. The creature tilted its head, studying her with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Run," it whispered, its voice a gurgling rasp that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Emma didn't need to be told twice. She spun on her heel and bolted, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she sprinted down the path. The creature's laughter followed her, a sound that was equal parts human and animal. It was playing with her, toying with her. She could hear it behind her, its footsteps unnervingly silent despite its size. The car was just ahead, its outline barely visible in the darkness. Emma fumbled for the keys in her pocket, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip them. She risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. The creature was closer now, its form shifting and distorting as it moved. One moment it was a man, the next a wolf, then something in between. Its eyes never left hers, burning with a hunger that made her blood run cold. She reached the car and yanked the door open, throwing herself inside. The engine roared to life as she slammed the gearshift into drive. The tires screeched as she peeled out, kicking up a cloud of dust in her wake. For a moment she thought she was safe. The creature was gone, swallowed by the darkness. But as she glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart stopped. It was there, sitting in the back seat. Its grin widened and it leaned forward, its breath hot against her ear. "You can't outrun me," it whispered. Emma's scream tore through the night, but the sound was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the desert. Her hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly her fingers ached, her knuckles white as bone. The creature in the back seat didn't move, didn't breathe, it just sat there, its glowing eyes locked onto hers in the rearview mirror. Its grin was a jagged slash across its distorted face, too wide, too sharp, too wrong. She couldn't look away. The road ahead was a blur, the headlights cutting through the darkness but offering no comfort. The creature's presence was suffocating, filling the car with a cold, oppressive energy that made her skin crawl. Its voice, when it spoke again, was a guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate in her bones. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, tilting its head like a curious animal. Its neck bent at an unnatural angle, the motion too fluid, too inhuman. But now that you're here, you'll make a good game." Emma's mind raced. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The car was moving too fast, the tires skidding on the loose gravel as she swerved around a bend. She had to get rid of it. She had to do something. Without thinking, she slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, the seatbelt cutting into her chest as she lurched forward. The creature, however, didn't move. It didn't even flinch. It just stared at her, its grin widening impossibly further. "Clever?" it hissed, its voice dripping with mockery. "But not clever enough." Emma fumbled with the seatbelt, her fingers trembling as she unbuckled it. She threw the door open and stumbled out into the night, the cold air hitting her like a slap. The desert stretched out around her, vast and empty, the moon casting long shadows across the ground. She could hear the creature moving behind her, the sound of its shifting form making her stomach churn. She ran. She didn't know where she was going, didn't care. All that mattered was getting away. The flashlight was still in her hand, its beam bouncing wildly as she sprinted across the uneven terrain. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Behind her, she heard the creature's laughter, a low, guttural sound that seemed to echo in her skull. It wasn't chasing her, not yet. It was toying with her, letting her think she had a chance. But she knew better. She could feel its presence, a dark, oppressive weight that followed her like a shadow. The ground beneath her feet changed, the gravel giving way to soft, powdery sand. She was in the dunes now, the landscape shifting and twisting in the moonlight. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the voices grew louder, more distinct. They were speaking in a language she didn't understand, their words harsh and guttural, filled with malice. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled to a stop. The whispers surrounded her, coming from every direction. She swung the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the endless expanse of sand and shadows. And then she saw it. A figure stood at the top of a dune, silhouetted against the moon. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its posture too hunched. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there watching her. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, her foot sinking into the sand. The figure tilted its head, the motion eerily familiar. And then it began to move. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It glided, its form shifting and distorting as it descended the dune. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were almost deafening. Emma's legs gave out and she fell to her knees, the flashlight slipping from her grasp. The beam flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. The creature was close now. She could feel its breath on her skin, hot and rancid. Its glowing eyes were the only thing she could see, burning like twin suns in the void. It leaned down, its face inches from hers, and she could see the jagged teeth, the too wide grin, the hunger in its eyes. "You can't run," it whispered, its voice a gurgling rasp. "You can't hide. You're mine now." Emma's vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but she was paralyzed. The creature's presence was overwhelming, its power crushing her will. And then, just as it reached for her, a sound broke through the whispers. A distant, rhythmic thumping, growing louder and louder. The creature froze, its head snapping up as it scanned the horizon. Its grin faltered, and for the first time, Emma saw something in its eyes: fear. The thumping grew louder, closer. And then, out of the darkness, a pair of headlights appeared, cutting through the night like a beacon of hope. A truck roared into view, its engine growling as it skidded to a stop. The door flew open and a man jumped out, a rifle in his hands. "Get in," he shouted, his voice rough and urgent. Emma didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet and ran toward the truck, her legs trembling with every step. The creature let out a guttural snarl, its form shifting and writhing as it lunged after her. But the man was faster. He raised the rifle and fired, the shot echoing through the night. The creature howled, a sound that was equal parts pain and rage. It staggered back, its form flickering like a dying flame. Emma threw herself into the truck, slamming the door shut behind her. The man jumped in after her, throwing the truck into gear and peeling out. Emma glanced out the window, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature was still there, standing in the middle of the dunes, its glowing eyes burning with hatred. But it didn't follow. It just watched as the truck sped away, its form slowly fading into the darkness. For a moment there was silence. Then the man spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You're lucky I found you," he said, his eyes fixed on the road. "But it's not over. It's never over with them." Emma didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was still reeling, her body trembling with adrenaline. She glanced at the man, his face illuminated by the dashboard lights. He looked rough, weathered, like he'd seen too much. But there was something in his eyes, something that told her he knew exactly what she'd been through. What was that thing?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer right away. He just gripped the steering wheel tighter, his jaw clenched. "A skinwalker," he said at last. "And it's not done with you." The truck sped down the empty highway, the desert stretching endlessly on either side. Emma stared out the window, her mind racing, but just as she began to feel a flicker of hope, the man beside her turned his head slowly, his eyes glowing the same sickly yellow as the creature's. "You should have stayed in the dunes," he said, his voice no longer human. The engine sputtered and died, plunging them into silence and darkness.